All right, guys, this is the last lecture for Rome. A little bit longer, so you guys, you'll have that long weekend to finish. But again, you don't have to copy everything down. I'll try to kind of limit it a little bit, or at least emphasize even the underlying stuff. So prior to 81 BCE, we know Rome was more of a republic, right, where you had those two consuls who were kind of held to accountability by the Senate and those assemblies. But around 81 BCE, we see some change, and the first kind of ruler who, kind of consolidates power is Sulla. He was a dictator, and Caesar, Sulla, they were able to consolidate power because they had these private armies, or they had armies that were very loyal to them. And then even after Sulla, there were more clashes between generals for leadership. So Caesar comes along and he overthrows Sulla, and he was an aristocrat, a patrician, a senator, and unlike Sulla and others, he was very popular, especially with plebeians. So it was easy for him to consolidate power, mostly because the people were okay with him. So when Caesar becomes dictator for life, that is considered the end of the republic. Like Sulla, he relied on his army to secure that title, almost like a military dictatorship in a sense. Hitler kind of did the same in a sense. Napoleon, when you can control that military, it's going to be easier to, take over. We study Caesar mostly because of what he did for Rome. He was very popular with the people. He introduced a more modern calendar. If you recall, that was in John Green's video, with modern months or terms for months. He also increased the size of the Senate, which is interesting because the Senate ends up assassinating him. But it does give more people kind of a voice in a sense, even if they were wealthy aristocrats. He does extend citizenship to outsiders, which is important. He gives land to poor veterans to kind of ensure that loyalty. And his conquests included Egypt and Germany. And we know that he was later assassinated because of jealousy, right? Those senators were fearing this consolidation of power. He was not an emperor. He was still kind of he was still playing the rules in a sense, but he basically made himself a dictator for life. So there was no tenure anymore. All right, so his replacement, or the person that eventually takes over, is Augustus. That was his great nephew. He was the heir. His real name was Octavian, but then he took the name Augustus. He was the sole ruler of Rome by 27 BCE. We're getting closer to that turning point in history, right? And as ruler, he really wanted to keep the peace, promote prosperity, and he did that. He never called himself emperor, even though he was really the emperor. Again, more than, say, dictator for life. He called himself princeps, or first citizen, and the government now was known as the Roman Principate, or Principat, and it meant, or Principat means government of the princeps. It was a new political structure in that it was a true monarchy, right? Only he wasn't born into that position in a sense. He was chosen. He held all power. The Senate was pretty much powerless. And his term was known as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, for about 200 years. Even though he didn't rule, those who came after him kind of maintained his traditions. And that was his goal, to establish a regime that would last beyond his life. But he never wanted to make himself king. And Washington was similar. When Washington became president, they asked him, what do we want to call you? Your Excellency. And he said no. He rejected those types of titles, like not king necessarily, but titles that kind of might have made him appear to be, king-like. Augustus, there was still the Republic, but they were pretty much powerless, and mostly because Augustus took power away from the Senate to tax and control the army. So they would still, create laws. The assemblies would still perform their duties, but when it came to those two major issues, basically funding and military power, Augustus ruled. He also appointed governors. It was a centralized government with a deep bureaucracy, and those governors governed the provinces, right, in his name. He did that because he didn't want these provincial armies or leaders to challenge him. So he appointed men that were loyal to him. Um, and He also demobilized the military. So even though he had military leaders governing, those provinces didn't have militaries per se, or at least strong armies. And the point of that was basically to, avoid kind of a coup or a takeover by one province over another. All right, so what was society like in this Pax Romana period? Under Augustus, we started to see more social mobility. Plebeians were not jetting up the ladder, but we started to see a new class emerge called the equestrian class or aristocracy. These were not rich landowners or poor landowners, but more a middle class, and they were taking positions in the government. So again, they didn't have as much land as the patrician, but they had more land than, say, the plebeian or the poor soldier farmer. And as time would go on under Augustus, the patricians would begin to lose less influence in those assemblies. But they didn't complain or revolt because Augustus would pay them off in the form of gladiator games, sports, grain, and overall peace and prosperity. Hitler did the same thing with his people, right? He ensured or gave them jobs and paid vacations. So we see similar actions by these dictators to kind of control the people. From an infrastructure standpoint, we start to see the growth of roads. These roads would help connect the Roman Empire with Asia, also communicate back and forth from one military group to another. Walls and fortresses were built throughout the empire to protect the empire against invasion. And, throughout his reign, we saw a growing population. By the time he was gone, the number of citizens was up to 4 million people, or men, right? Because only men were citizens. And it also the empire reached its largest size under his term. And that initiates the study of geography. So we see kind of a new learning aspect. Law was also important. You studied law, or you could study law. We saw that with 12 tables, right? That kind of results in the creation of lawyers and law experts. However, in terms of justice, the courts still tended to treat the lower classes differently. The wealthy patricians usually faced lighter punishments than the plebeians for similar crimes. So we see inequality in terms of justice and legal matters. All right, women. Women also saw some gains. This is still patriarchal, but they were probably better off than, say, Greek women. Probably not as well off as, say, Persian women, but by this time the Persian Empire was under the control of the Roman Empire anyway. So you start to see more of a blending in terms of custom and culture. So women could start to initiate divorce. They did have property rights. They started to run businesses, and they could attend social events. And we know that's documented from the art and literature. And here's a fresco painting showing women perhaps at a ball or a party. They still could not vote, and their punishments were harsher, especially when it came to adultery. If men performed adultery, they were not executed, but women were. All right, so literature and philosophy also grew during this Pax Romana period. Two famous writers were Tacitus and Livy. You'll be reading about Tacitus soon. There was also that Greek writer Polemius, I forgot his name, but these were Roman writers who, again, were born and were citizens of Rome. They were influenced by Greek writers and Greek traditions, so we see, again, kind of a transfer of culture. They were poets. Poetry was kind of the common form of literature that was developing. Philosophy was also important. You got to know this, and that would be a great essay comparing the philosophers of Greek to the philosophers of Rome. Not necessarily a name, but a philosophy. So Roman philosophers believed in, I can't really say this, but I think it's actually, you're going to have to pronounce it, but Epicureanism, there you go, Epicureanism. And it's this philosophy of living simply, enjoying pleasures, and not necessarily focusing on so much on the gods, living less in fear of punishment, and kind of enjoying life. Stoicism was another philosophy, and this was, again, just kind of let things happen, accept the will of God, let nature take its course, and kind of detach not only from pain but also from pleasure. And Stoics would seek answers to questions about life, very similar to obviously what Socrates encouraged, right? Asking questions to develop a better understanding of life and science and everything. So that's Stoicism and Epicureanism. All right, the Roman religion was polytheistic initially. Eventually, the Romans would embrace Christianity. But early on, we saw syncretism, and again, that's a term that means the combining of different cultures. And Romans would fuse local gods with Greek gods. Here you go. These are the Roman gods: Jupiter, Neptune, Juno, Pluto, Mars, Mercury, Apollo. And again, their gods had similar characteristics to the Roman gods. I mean, the Greek gods. All citizens had to were required to worship these gods. There was toleration of other religions, like the Persians, who were practicing, early monotheism, as long as they were supportive and they would perform military service and pay taxes. Um, there was obviously the state religion, which would be the gods we see here, headed by Jupiter, and the emperor was not godlike, but he was seen at that level in a sense. Augustus never believed he was godlike, but the people did revere him so much so that he was on the same par. Um, in the home, you might have had personal gods like Lares or Penates who would protect the home. And then there were public and mystery cults that also emerged, pagan worshiping. And these cults often promoted an afterlife. It's not monotheism, but it's this spirituality that has some connections to, again, heaven and perhaps hell. And these cults were kind of embraced by Greek um, peoples and Egypt peoples who were obviously now under or in the empire of the Romans. All right, so we're going to talk a little about Jews. Jerusalem obviously was kind of the central capital of the Hebrews. It was captured in 37 BCE by the Romans. Um, the Romans were interested in this new monotheistic religion, but they didn't embrace it completely. And because the Jews were not necessarily conforming to polytheism, they were persecuted. And we'll do a little lesson on that on Monday, but it wasn't pretty, let's put it that way. And this persecution pushed Jews out of the region, and it led to, obviously, migration into parts of Europe, into Asia, into Africa. Um, Educated Jews throughout this region were sometimes embraced, again, because of their intellect, their business acumen. But that led to resentment, especially in barbarian communities. And that's going to be something that perpetuates going forward, this idea of kind of resentment towards the Hebrew people. Mostly because, again, they were either not embracing the local customs or religions, they were isolating themselves, or they were kind of given certain advantages in urban areas. All right, so we see a new religion emerge during the Roman era, and it's Christianity. I'm not going to get into a little mini lecture on Jesus, but what you want to know is why. Why were so many people in the Roman Empire embracing Christianity? Mostly because it appealed to the poor. It appealed to those plebeians, the slaves, the women. Because Christianity promotes kind of equality under God, right? It appealed to people who were just hungry for answers about life, and Jesus gave them hope for an afterlife, a better life. Peter and Paul are two important people. This is a concept in the curriculum. Um, Basically, the idea of not they weren't prophets; they were um, teachers or followers. They were spreading gospel. So you want to definitely kind of remember, individuals like this. We're going to learn about um, Islamic teachers and men who spread Islam. Um, we're going to learn about men who spread Buddhism. So Peter and Paul were spreading Christianity. Peter eventually becomes the first pope of the Catholic Church, and Paul is known for spreading the gospel throughout the Mediterranean region, Greece, Italy, parts of northern Africa. Um, he also was a student of Greek philosophy, and he's going to kind of not spread that, but kind of bring a lot of those ideas and philosophies back to the Mediterranean world. So Peter and Paul. All right, so just some basics again. Why what was attractive about Christianity? Not only did it appeal to the poor, but it was a simple life. It was similar to Buddhism in the sense that you worshipped and that you reflected. I'm sorry, not worship, but you reflected, you meditated. Um, Teachers or would learn or study at monasteries. You're going to also see that with Buddhists who study the religion in a monastery. It's a church. These monasteries are going to pop up all over Europe and even eventually in the Americas as Christianity spreads to the Americas. Martyrdom was a key philosophy, and it's this idea of dying rather than giving up your beliefs. That would be a key component of Christianity. And these ideas and the ideas of Jesus and Christianity would be written into the Gospels. Again, written documentation, scripture, right? Like the Ten Commandments, like the Quran, like obviously the Torah or the First Testament, right? So, or the Old Testament. All right, so Constantine. Constantine is very important, very easy to remember. He is one of the last Roman emperors, and he is actually going to preside over Rome when Rome splits into two pieces. Initially, he governs the Roman Empire from Rome, but then he moves the empire, the capital, to Constantinople. Today, that's Istanbul. It's in Turkey. He's important because he actually embraces Christianity. He's the first emperor to do that, and he legalizes it in an edict known as the Edict of Milan. And because of that, he is the first Christian emperor. Augustus was not a believer in Christianity, so we're going to give Constantine that credit. We're going to learn more about him when we study the Byzantine Empire. Basically, the Roman Empire is going to split, and eventually the eastern part, which was his part, would be kind of rearranged into a new empire called the Byzantine Empire. And here it is. So literally you have two empires. The Pope will kind of govern the Western Empire, and Constantine will govern the Eastern Roman Empire. And the Eastern Roman Empire eventually will become, under the Byzantine or in the Byzantine Empire, would become Orthodox, and we'll get down into that later on. All right, so a little bit about some diffusion or seeing Christianity spread into other parts of the world. We see Christianity emerge in Egypt. The first Christian monastery was built in Egypt by Pachomius in the 4th century, which would be 300 CE. Aksum, even Christianity spreads into Ethiopia, which is kind of southern or south of Egypt. Aksum is the city where we would see, if you look right over here, these are Christian churches, right, that emerge in Africa around 313 BCE. So prior to, that should be CE, not BCE, CE. We also see Christianity emerge in Algeria, which is northern Africa. Hippo, this is a famous city in Algeria. We see, as you can see here, there's a kind of a church or monastery. And St. Augustine was famous. If you've ever heard of St. Augustine in Florida. He was a monk, and he lived in Hippo, and he actually wrote The City of God. And again, what he's doing is he's promoting Christianity in another part of the world. He is spreading Christianity. Um, and again, he would be someone else like Peter or like Paul. All right, let's talk about trade. The Egyptian, the Romans were exporters and importers, but more importing, I would say, not by much, but they're going to be exporting a lot of finished goods, but they're going to be importing a lot of products like silk, like spices, along these silk roads. The silk roads are very important. You have to understand the idea. It's pretty simple. Roads from China all the way into Europe. And not only are you going to be transferring products, but you're going to be transporting religions, not only Christianity, but Buddhism, Islam, Taoism, and other religions. In Africa, you had the Trans-Sahara roads that would help connect Rome into Egypt. Textiles, oil, and gold would be imported into the Egyptian Empire. Also, sea routes are very important. You could sail from Italy to India through some of these water bodies. You might have to make a little land travel, but you could theoretically travel from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. Wasn't easy. Navigation wasn't the greatest, but there is evidence that sailors made it all the way to England. Pirates were very common, so it wasn't the safest mode of transportation, but it was pretty effective. So that would be the Red Sea, Indian Ocean, and Mediterranean trade routes. All right, what about technology? The Romans weren't necessary. They were known for some great innovations, but they also embraced innovations from China or Asia, like the stirrup for horses. Obviously, silk and gold were valuable items, and fruits, rice, and vegetables were also imported. So I wouldn't say that's technology, but the stirrups that's a great example. Also, the Chinese were known to exchange military technologies, eventually. I'd have to go back to it, but gunpowder. I think that's a little later on, but again, I'd have to go back to that. But we'll focus on stirrups mostly. All right, so like any empire, eventually the Roman Empire falls. By 200 CE, the population was down from 1 million to about 100,000, and that's pretty amazing. Mostly because of invasion. Invasions from what would be modern-day Russia, modern-day Germany. I have to see it. It's a hard map to see. Viking invasions from Norway, Finland, Poland. And these groups were known as Franks, who would later settle France, Angles and Saxons, who would later found England, Huns that would come into the Roman Empire, Attila, if you've ever seen Night at the Museum, Attila the Hun. Vandals, where we get the word vandalism from, would come in and pretty much destroy everything in their path. All right, so the barbarian attacks were very significant. Over time, the Roman Empire was just unable to defend its empire, especially in further or outlying areas in Europe, like England, France. These barbaric groups, like the Huns, here's Attila, were very ferocious, and they didn't have anything else to do but attack. They weren't traders, they weren't businessmen, they were barbaric groups that basically ransacked and stole. Attila the Hun pushed into Gaul. From the east, Gaul would be... I'm not sure where Gaul is. I think Gaul would be France. And he pushes in and then pushes other barbarian groups further into Western Europe. We have the Franks, who invaded modern-day France, the Vandals, who sacked, which would be, looks like that's Greece. The Vandals kind of entered into Greece and northern Greece. And eventually in 410, Visigoths, would take Rome in 410. That's kind of when that empire moves into Constantinople. By 476, the final emperor of Rome was removed. The Pope would emerge in Rome eventually. The Germanic tribes, wherever they were, would implement puppet emperors in those Roman cities. So the Western Empire by 476 was pretty much gone. Again, Catholicism and Christianity was still there, and the Pope did have power, but there was no longer an emperor. So you basically had just kingdoms everywhere. Italy, Germany, France. So it was kind of just a mess, chaotic, very diverse in a sense, but no unity whatsoever. There is evidence that Goths and Vandals did actually live alongside Romans for a little while. They didn't just come in and destroy. There was kind of a process. And those groups did adopt those customs and language. That's why when countries like France and England and Ireland and Spain emerge, they speak, or their languages are derived from Latin. They are Christian. They do have a lot of the same customs, implement or take in the science or architecture of Rome. All right, so the barbarian attacks were very important, but why? Why was the empire unable to defend itself? It has to do with disease. We'll start with disease. Yes, you're bringing in silk and all these great products, but you're also bringing disease in from Asia, and those diseases wiped out populations. And with fewer people, you had fewer taxes being paid, and when there's less money, the centralized government can't fix things like roads or aqueducts or bridges, and you can't pay your soldiers. So as time would go on, those militaries would weaken, and you have invasion, right? Those invaders also just basically stole and looted the wealth of the empire. So, those barbarian groups played a big role, but unfortunately there were other factors that might have made it easier for them to attack and invade and take over. The government failed. Obviously, it wasn't their fault necessarily that disease ravaged the empire, but they did contribute to the weakening of the economy. They devalued their currency. They basically started to make metal currency out of metals that weren't as strong or durable. So instead of gold pieces, perhaps, maybe gold was mixed with other metals. So people really didn't necessarily want it in exchange for an item, right? So eventually, especially Europeans, they would just start trading goods for goods. And because there was less currency floating around, taxes were now being paid in grain. That's not helping merchants. That's not helping, the government. Soldiers necessarily didn't want grain. They wanted gold pieces, right? Also, there was a lack of agricultural innovation. These were not Chinese or Egyptian innovators. So farming was not that significant, not like in Mesopotamia or Egypt. There just wasn't a lot of food. There was enough early on, but eventually they didn't have that surplus. Not to mention, different regions had different products. So there just wasn't a lot of economic diversity. So as these invasions came in, or as these invaders came in, they would disrupt trade. And, certain regions couldn't get certain products that were important. Certain regions couldn't get food or grain. So basically, as time would go on, just the overall economy of the Roman Empire would decline, and there was less wealth, less protection, and you have basically a downfall. Environmental problems contributed. Soil erosion made it harder to farm, hence why there was probably not a lot of surplus. They overfarmed, they overgrazed, and there was just basically the land got destroyed and ripped apart. They would destroy forests to build, so you didn't have those ecosystems. So that contributed definitely to drought, to famine at times. So it's just, again, there's no single reason, but there were a lot of factors. Definitely would be a great essay comparing the decline of this empire to the decline of another empire. So definitely be able to articulate why the Roman Empire declined. All right, so this is the last slide. What were the legacies? Laws and government, obviously, our government and future democratic governments around Europe basically were modeled after the Romans. The representative republic, the 12 tables, the courts that were that involved plebeians. Also architecture, domes, paved roads, columns, temples, theaters, aqueducts. Aqueducts were water transport systems, sewers, underfloor heating, and obviously the military. Their siege devices, catapults, and legions, or kind of regiments, were used by armies going forward. And obviously language. Latin is the basis of English, Spanish, French, and don't forget, Latin emerges from the Phoenicians. All right, guys, that's it. I'll see you guys on Monday.